Well, it's hard for me to believe that it's already Wednesday. Um, I know it might not be hard for you since you've had to put up with me, but there are times when you do what I do that you get to the place where you're going to spend a few days and you preach the first service and you feel like you've been there a week. And you're ready to load up the car and get on back down the road. But then there are other times when you come to the end and you wonder where the time has gone, and this has been one of those times. So thank you for being so kind in feeding me. You can tell I'm wasting away to nothing. I don't even have a sport coat that'll fit me. I ran through them all the 2 nights, but anyhow, I really appreciate it, and I'm thankful for your church. I'm thankful for your pastor and his family. Don't you love your pastor? I thought you did, or I wouldn't have asked. That'd be a bad scene, wouldn't it? If you don't you love your pastor and no one says a word. So anyhow, if you have your Bible, I want to ask you to open up to Mark chapter 4. We're going to circle back to where we began on Sunday morning. What we're going to do is we're going to read the closing verse of that particular chapter, and then we're going to read right into chapter 5. We'll read verses 1 through 7. And after we reach verse 7, we're going to skip over. Many of you, good people on Wednesday night, many of you will be familiar with the passage that we're going to be in. It's the story of the demoniac. Not all, but many will be familiar. And so you'll know that when we skip down to verse 17, that I'm skipping over the work, the miracle that Jesus performs in this man's life. And I'll tell you why I'm doing it, because in the story there are some pigs there. And I found that people like to get caught up on the pigs. I've sat in Sunday school classes where they just won't hush about the pigs. They go on and on and on. I know that would never happen around here, but most places I go, there's someone that will take over. And the thing that bugs me is this story isn't about pigs, it's about people. More importantly, it's about the person that can make the difference in the people's lives. And so we're going to skip down to verse 17, and then we'll read through verse 20 and trust that the Spirit will take us to where He wants us to be. Mark chapter 4, verse 41. And the disciples feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. And when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he'd often been bound with shackles and chains. And the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Verse 17. Then they, the townspeople, began to plead with Jesus to depart from their region. And when he got into the boat, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus didn't permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them the great things the Lord has done for you, and how he has had compassion on you." And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. I think it's a fair statement to say that for the disciples, it had been an overwhelming day. You remember, they had been in the boat with Jesus. And while they were in the boat with Jesus, all day, mind you, Jesus began to teach to the crowds who have gathered there on the shore. Only today, after 2 or so years of teaching plainly his Father's kingdom, today he shakes things up just a bit. Today he begins for the first time to speak in parables. He had talked about common things, but used them in ordinary, uncommon ways. You remember, he first spoke about a sower, seed, and soils. And from there he moved on to talk about the lamp that has come, not to be placed under a measuring basket, not to be placed under a bed. He moves to the next story about a man that plants a seed. And mysteriously, no one can explain how, it just happens. The seed does its work. And then finally, he capped the day off with what seems to be insignificant, but actually becomes unstoppable. He says the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds, but when it's planted and it does what it does, when it grows, it becomes greater than all the herbs, so much so that the birds of the air, the fowl of the air, can find shelter in its branches. I'm telling you, you don't have to agree, but in my mind, it must have been overwhelming. And so now we watch them as they head to the other side. You remember, it was in verse 35 that Jesus gave the command, let's cross over. And they were more than willing to do that. So as Jesus commanded, they obeyed. You remember the story if you were here on Sunday morning. You'll recall that the sea was gently rocking the boat and the wind was peacefully blowing in the darkness of the night. And as Jesus is sleeping in the back of the boat, he finds a mat in the stern. The disciples encounter a great windstorm. Hurricane force winds. We see that the gentle sea has become ferocious. It's slapping and they're fighting the battle and they're doing everything they know to do, but somehow this is one storm. This is one time that it seems like it has the upper hand. The boat is beginning to fill with water. And in the midst of it all, Jesus is sleeping. They wake him up and they say, "Don't you care?" And Jesus walks to the front of the boat and he speaks into the chaos, speaks into the darkness. And we watch that the sea becomes as glass, and it's smooth sailing from there on out. And really, it shouldn't have come as a surprise to them, because you'll remember I made a point to say again that it was Jesus that had commanded them to go to the other side. And when Jesus says you're going to make it to the other side, you're going to make it to the other side. Someone needs to take hold of that tonight, because you feel like the world is falling apart around you, that everything is raging. When you walk with Jesus, you will get where he intends you to be. I'm thankful for that. And so we watch as they're sitting there, sailing to what really will be an unexpected place. Now remember, they had just come through one physical storm, and they're literally about to enter into another. Oh, it won't be a literal storm with wind, thunder, and lightning and waves, but it'll be a storm nonetheless. And while they continue to sail, wet with the sea, chilled with the night air, we hear them asking a question right out loud. They're saying, "Who is this?" And that's a weird question to me. It's strange in my mind, because I've said it over and over. They've been with Jesus now for well over 2 years. They've listened to him. They've walked with him. But now we hear them asking right out loud, "Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And I'll suggest that it's likely not the first time they've ever had this question. But it's the first time that we hear it right out loud. They're verbalizing what has happened in their minds before. And I don't say that in a critical way. I don't say that in an accusatory way, trying to make them something less. I mean, when you think about their 2 years up to this point with Jesus, how could you blame them for asking the question? I mean, when you even begin the way that we remember how the journey began with them, I'm recalling at least 4. You remember right at the beginning of Mark's gospel, there in chapter 1, as Jesus steps on the stage of humanity, he now begins to teach his Father's kingdom, and he's going to call the disciples. And the first men he go to are fishermen. You remember fishermen, they cast the net and draw the net. They cast the net and draw the net, and then they'll mend the net from the night's work in order to be able to do it all over again when it was fishing time. And so we watch them as they're mending the nets on this day, when along came this man, in all actuality, that they really didn't know anything about. And he stood before them, and he issued them an invitation. It's more like a command, it's imperative, but it's an invitation of sorts. He says to them, "You follow me, and I will make you to become what I want you to be. You follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Now that doesn't make much sense. And here's that guy that they don't know a lot about, and he's talking about transforming fishermen into fishing for man. And you realize this is the way they met their obligations. This is the way they kept a roof over their head. This is the way they put food on the table. And now he's inviting them to fish for. Folks, you know, you cannot sell filet of man. It won't go over at the marketplace. They're going to go. And yet, that's the invitation. And even though it doesn't make sense, there must have been something about the way he spoke it, the passion behind those words, the intensity in his eyes. Because when he invited them to step into a new world, you know what the word says? It's almost without thought. It's immediately they forsook, they left the old behind and stepped into a new world of following in the footsteps of Jesus. Who can this be that at the sound of his voice, fishermen, men will lay down their nets, leave the old behind, and step into a new unknown world, following Jesus into an adventure like they would never know before? They've had to have asked the question. Now, if you were here on Sunday morning, you'll remember that I mentioned shortly after that calling of those first men, you find them now in the synagogue. It's what they do on Sabbath day. And you'll recall that Jesus is teaching. And as he's teaching, everybody there is hanging on every syllable that comes from his mouth. They're captivated by his words. Their jaws are on the ground. Why? Because he speaks as one having authority and not as the scribes. Well, that authority is going to be displayed because there's a man there consumed with evil. And as Jesus begins to speak, the evil in that man leaves. I'm telling you, everybody in that synagogue that day must have been asking the question, who can this be? What kind of man at the sound of his voice puts the devil on the run? They've had to have asked the question. Now, I could take you to the end of chapter 1. We've not looked at that at all. But we see it's right after. The disciples are telling Jesus to come back to the house. You remember he cast out all the evil, sickness, sin, and disease in one evening in that region. So everybody now wants to make him the king. You know, they want to, and they say, you got to come back to the house. And Jesus says, no, let's get away from this mess. I've got to go to these surrounding villages and towns. Why? That I may preach there also for this purpose. If you ever wondered why he came, for this purpose I have come forth. And we watch him as he's doing what he said he came to do, when all of a sudden there's a man inserted into the text. We meet somebody who's on the outside. And the reason he's out there is because he's unclean. It's really a crazy thing, because sickness, sin, and disease were all tied together in Jewish thought process. It was seen, anything infirmity, any sickness that was going on was seen as an expiation or a working out of the sin in that individual's lives. You remember the story that was asked about, the question that was asked about the blind man. Why is this man blind? Is it because of his sin, or is it sin from his family? It was all tied together. And see, this man, the infirmity was great. Why? Because he's a leper. And you know that if you're diagnosed as a leper, you're so highly contagious. If you stand on the same ground as someone within a certain number of feet, then all of a sudden that person is going to be defiled too. Or if you're standing downwind from a leper or from a certain distance, if the wind blows against his body and then brushes up against you, then you'll be defiled as well. So a leper was sentenced to a life on their own. We know that because the law says that the leper has to be put outside the camp. And that is, when you talk about being put outside of the camp, we're not talking about a KOA or what is it, that Jellystone, Yogi Bear, whatever it might be. We're not talking about that kind of thing. Have you never seen any of those places? Come on. I mean, we're talking about being put outside the confines of human habitation, outside the city limits, out by the trash dump. And it's fitting. Why? Because that's what he is. You want to know this man? He is nothing but the filth of living, the refuse of society. He is living trash. He might as well go out there and wait for his time to come to an end and pray that it comes quickly. He's not welcome in polite society, but today he hears that Jesus is in town. And something about the arrival of Jesus causes this man to do what he ought not do, because we watch him breaking the rules as he comes right to the place where Jesus is. He's not keeping the required distance. He's not crying out unclean, but he doesn't have to. Because you realize when he gets close enough, all of a sudden he begins to, they begin to smell the rotting flesh. They look and they can tell by the way he appears, the unkept hair, the ashen face, the torn clothing, the decaying flesh. They know that this man is unclean. And if they are close enough, they'll become unclean. Since he's not keeping the required distance, they'll create the distance themselves. So you watch. Everybody begins to part, but they're amazed as they notice that Jesus stands firm in his position. The leper continues right up to where Jesus is, falls before him, and in trembling voice, everybody can hear him as he says, "If you're willing, if you want to, you can make me clean." And then there's a collective gasp that goes over the crowd as Jesus reaches out and touches the untouchable. Don't you know, Jesus, that if you touch the defiled one, then you're going to be defiled? But see, here's the thing about Jesus. He wasn't worried about getting what the leper had. He knew the leper would get what he had. And so now, as he spoke and said, "I want to," as quickly as the words came from his mouth, the man was made whole. The leprosy, what kind of man speaks to defilement and the defilement is no more? I'm telling you, folks, they have had to have asked the question, who is this? The one whose voice can lift people from their sick bed, who can lift crippled folks from their mat that they're imprisoned to. Who is this? The one that loves the ones that nobody else cares about, loves the unlovables, embraces the untouchables. It's the question they're asking. It's likely the question that they have been asking. And I can guarantee you it's a question that they'll be confronted with in Mark chapter 8. Now, we're not there, but if we fast forward to the story, you'll remember as Jesus and the disciples, now it's 3 years. Now they're literally going to begin their journey toward Jerusalem, the journey toward the cross. And as they're going through the region of Caesarea Philippi, we hear as Jesus asks a question of the disciples. He says, "Who do people say that I am?" And it seems like this was the moment they're waiting for, because remember, in over 3 years now, Jesus has not once affirmed his identity. But now, the disciples, having been amongst the crowd, the disciples hearing what was being said, now they begin to spout off all the answers. Some say you're this, some say you're that, you're John the Baptist returned. But then in verse 29, Jesus redirects the question. He says, "But who do you say that I am?" See, it's a question that they were confronted with. It's a question, in all honesty, all of us here are confronted with. It's not good enough just to talk about what other people believe. It's not good enough to think that you're going to make it through on mom and dad's faith or mama and papa's faith. No, it's a personal relationship. You have to answer the question. And Simon does. He says, "You're the one." But see, that's chapter 8. And we're at the end of chapter 4. So now we hear them ask right out loud, "Who can this be? Who is this that even the wind and the seas obey him as they sail to the other side?" To an unlikely place, to the Decapolis, the region of the Gadarenes. The reason it's unlikely is because you're good people on Wednesday night, you know that this is a God-forsaken place. In fact, no respectable Jew, no religious man would find himself there. Why? Because it's the land of the pigs. Not the four-legged kind, the two-legged kind. Or maybe it'd be more appropriate to say the dogs, not four-legged, two-legged, Gentile territory. And you know that the Gentiles weren't God's chosen people. That makes them lesser there. And if God doesn't choose them, why would the Jewish folks? If God doesn't love them, why would they love them? So that's where they're heading. And you have to ask the question, why would they do that? Simply because it's where he is. It's where he had been. It's where he would be. Who is he? No other way to say it. Another throwaway of society. That's where we enter in to the story of the demoniac. And if you've heard the story, you know that this man is overcome with evil. In fact, evil will say a legion. Now, evil will lie, so we don't know how many they were. We just know it was a lot. And it's safe to assume, without doing any harm to the text, that this guy was likely at one point a pretty good guy. I shouldn't say pretty good. He might have just been a good guy all around. He could have been a kind fellow, maybe normal. What is normal? Who's normal out there? I want to see. Put your hand down, brother. I can tell you that you need to straighten him out later if he thinks he's normal. But anyhow, I mean, he was likely normal. And probably, now we have no allusion to this, but because of what his age is believed to be in the culture of the day, he might have had a young family. Now, I don't know that, but maybe he had a young bride, maybe he had some young children. We do know that he had friends. How do we know that? Because they're mentioned later in the text. But see, it seems like there was a point in time that something changed within this man. It's almost as though we can see as he cracks the door of his heart open to some sort of evil. It seemed innocent as enough, but with the door cracked just a bit, evil took full advantage, kicked it wide open, and now the legion marched in. Now his personality has been completely usurped by the evil. He's identified by that. He's likely to say that he's become unbearable. The reason I say that is He didn't have a home of his own, which leads me to believe that if he did have a young family, that the wife finally reached the point where she had had enough. His cruelty has gone on too long. The kids have been scared long enough, and so she does all that she can do. She gathers her friends, gathers her family, and they put him out of his home. He once had friends, we've established that, but it doesn't seem like he has them anymore. It's almost as though at this point none of them to be found. Could it be that he wore out his welcome? Could it be that finally they'd reached the point where they decided, just as his family threw him out, that they want to get rid of him as well? Now, why would they do that? Because he's a menace. There's no other way to say it. They can't take it anymore. Like I said, he's unbearable. They've had enough. So now they throw him out of the village. They throw him out of the camp, out of the town. They actually take him to a far place away, it would seem, at least away from the village, because they take him up into the mountains. They take him up where the tombs are. He'll be forced to dwell amongst the dead. Do you really want to know who we meet here in Mark chapter 5? This is the walking dead before there ever was a television program. They tried to control him. They chain him up, but you heard the text. He broke those chains. They'd shackle his wrists and his ankles, but he'd shatter those shackles. He's a wild man that cannot be controlled. Night and day, he runs through the mountains, runs through the tombs, naked, crying out at the top of his voice. What would it sound like? A legion of demons crying out. What kind of horror would strike the heart of men that would hear that? It's one thing in the daytime. Have you noticed it's easy to be brave during the day? When you can see what's out in front of you, you can just kind of march into it. But when the sun goes down, things can become a little bit scary. Now, it's interesting because when I first started traveling, I told you I'm from Cincinnati. My mom and papa are from mom and dad, and of course my mom and papa, because that's where they came from, but are from around Williamsburg, Kentucky, over that way. And when I started traveling, people would think they were doing good for me. I don't want you to think that I'm trying to knock them or anything, but they'll say, "Oh, we've got you a house to stay in." And they would take me out in the middle of nowhere, Georgia. Now, I've been in the holler, but I've always been with people, you know. Middle of Georgia, middle of Alabama, middle of Pennsylvania, where I had to park my truck down at the bottom and ride a four-wheeler up to where I was staying. I mean, and when you're there and there's not even a street light, I'm sorry, folks, I like the sound of police cars and ambulances. I do. It lets me know that I'm not alone. Those people aren't doing real well, but at least I'm not alone. When the sun goes down, the cries of that legion that was controlling this man, yeah, I'm sure it traveled down that mountainside and through the streets of the village. It kept those people in fear. It was evidenced. When dusk would fall, they would slam the door and bar it. They would shutter the windows and lock it as best they could. They didn't want anything to do with this man. They tried to get rid of him, but they're always reminded at his cries. He's a wild man out of control. He simply can't be tamed. So they throw him away. But here's the thing we learn in chapter 5. He's not a throwaway to Jesus. It seems the very reason that the disciples and Jesus sailed through the storm in the darkness is because he heard his cry. He knew the misery this man was living in. His storm needed to be muzzled, just like the physical storm. This man's chaos had to end. Can I ask you, who is this that would sail through the night, through the middle of the storm, at the sound of one man's cry? Oh, aren't you thankful that he's the kind of God that looked across the great divide, that great chasm, and he heard the cries of helpless individuals. He heard your cry. He heard my cry, to the point that he was willing to leave all the splendor of glory and come and lower himself as a man and walk. That's the kind of God he is. But they're asking, who can this be? And the question's going to be answered. But it's amazing. It's from an unlikely source. We see it in the confrontation. Now you remember it says that when the boat comes to shore, that the man sees him from afar. And see, that's funny to me because my family are Appalachian, and afar can mean never mind. He sees him from a distance, and seeing him from a distance, the man runs to Jesus. It's being controlled by evil. The evil runs to Jesus. It's interesting to me that evil will run to him, but we won't. And then we watch, and let me just say this real quick, because I don't want you to think that it's the man that initiated the meeting. I've tried to say at different times this week that Jesus always comes to us. We don't simply choose when we come to him. He comes to us. I'm thankful that we have a good God that's filled with grace, and his prevenient grace. We don't talk about it a lot anymore, but it's that grace that goes before, that's constantly working even when we're unaware, bringing us to the point of meeting, the point of contact. And so Jesus and the disciples had crossed the sea. Had they not crossed the sea, he wouldn't be able to come to him. I just want to be sure that we have the biblical image, because it does run and falls before Jesus and worships him. Which again causes me, if evil will bow before him and worship, why won't we? And now, in that worship, there's going to be a question that's answered. The disciples are saying, who is this? And now we hear, as evil responds, listen to his words. What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? You want to know who this is? You want to know who, at the sound of his voice, the devil goes on the run? You want to know that at the sound of his voice, lame people are lifted to their feet. Defilement has to flee. The storm has to still. You want to know this is the long-awaited Messiah. This is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He is the one that has been sent to make everything right. I want to say, are you listening, fellas? I wonder, are we listening? That's who he is. Evil recognizes him. Why won't we? Acknowledges his greatness, and yet we fail to. The confrontation leads to the change. And this is where I've skipped quite a bit. But really, all we need to be reminded of is that Jesus completely restores this man. Don't you like that? Jesus completely restores this man. And some of you are disappointed we didn't talk about those pigs. I can see it in your face. I'll tell you what those pigs are. I'm not going to take a whole lesson time to do it. But I'll tell you what the pigs are. It's a foreshadowing of the final victory. nothing more. It's nothing less. Remember, the sea is the abyss. Symbol of chaos. The sea is the abyss. And there's coming a day in the final victory where the sea will become as glass. Why? Because chaos has been cast away forever. And we know that the devil and all of his angels are going to be cast finally. It's his hour now, but finally he will be cast into the everlasting abyss, never to rear his slew foot again. That's all it is. That's all it is. Don't make it more than that. That's what it is. But now we see what evil had stolen, Jesus restores. The imagery is incredible. He's clothed. Remember, he was running around naked. Clothes are a good thing, in case you're wondering. You know, I've been thankful for the 26 years that I've traveled. Everywhere I've gone, people are wearing clothes. I mean, that's a good thing. Some are wearing less than others, but at least, you know, they're covering the main parts. I don't know that I should have said that like that, but anyhow, I won't say it like that again. But anyhow, he's in his right mind. And you know what's coming next. Don't you wish God would do that for a few people you know? I'm praying for some of you. But anyhow, you got to believe his hair is combed. I used to know what that was like. And they're carrying on a conversation. Now, honestly, don't you wish you knew what they were talking about? This is one of those places that I really wish we had some more content, that we knew what the discussion was. Obviously, it's not important. Otherwise, it would be in the book. It's not. But I would love to hear what they're talking about. We see that he's clothed. He's in his right mind. His hair is combed. They're carrying on a conversation. And here comes the townspeople. I want to call them the village people, but some of you get up and do the YMCA. You're a wild bunch around here. I know how this goes. The townspeople come, and they're scared. Has some to do with those pigs, but not all. Some with the immediate change that has happened. I mean, what kind of, in their mind, sorcery could this be? I mean, and in their fear, isn't that funny? They're afraid of him when he was wild, and now that he's changed, they're afraid of him still. And in their fear, they begin to ask Jesus to leave. Isn't that unreal? Jesus, will you just get in your boat and go back to the other side of the lake? Jesus, you don't belong here. You and these men, you just go back to where you came from. And I'm not a wise man, not real smart, but there are a few things that I'm sure of. I know, for instance, that Jesus will always go where he's invited. He will always go where he's invited. But I've also learned he'll never stay where he's not welcome. And now we watch as these men are begging Jesus to go back to where he came from. Jesus is going to give them what they're asking for. He begins to climb into the boat, and we see one of the strangest scriptures, strangest pictures in Scripture that I think there is. Because in all actuality, I can't talk. All actuality, this is what made me say, just when you think you know Jesus, he does something wrong. And I know you don't like that, and what we're talking about is unexpected, but in my mind, it's wrong. Why? Because the Jesus I know, when this guy is begging to go with him, you know, he's been thrown out of his home. He's been thrown out of his village. They don't want him. And now he wants to be with Jesus. Let me go with you. See, and let me throw this out there. That's natural. That's the natural response when Jesus changes you. The evidence is you want to be where he is. And by the way, if Jesus hasn't changed you, he hasn't saved you. I'm not trying to be ugly. I'm just trying to tell you the truth. I'll answer for what I say to you. And if you're the same old mess you were before Jesus, and if you want to say, well, that's not true, okay, show me scripturally where anybody remained the same after Jesus touched them. And when you've been changed, you want to be where he is. And that, I was kidding around with you last night, said I was thankful I wasn't called to be a pastor. Because if I were called to be a pastor, I'd have to deal with you. I'm not good at that. And you'd have to deal with me, and trust me, you would run me off very quickly. Some of you can't take me for 4 days, 5 services. I mean, some people have stayed home, and if you don't like me, I guess that's what you should do. But anyhow, I don't think that I should have to twist your arm to be where Jesus is. I shouldn't have to beg you to fall in love with him. It's natural. Let me go with you. And see, the Jesus I know would say, all right, guys, move over. We're going to make a little bit of room. We're not going to be the 12 disciples and myself. We're going to be Jesus and the baker's dozen. We're going to have 13. I never claimed to be normal, so there. That's what I would think he would do. But we move from the change to the commission. However, Scripture says, Jesus did not permit him. Jesus said no. Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you. So as the man is begging to go, Jesus says, no, I need you to stay here. You go and you tell. And the incredible thing is, you know what the man does? He does it. He does what Jesus told him to do. And you would think that would be natural, but the leper at the end of chapter 1 didn't. You remember at the end of chapter 1, after he heals this man, Jesus says, hey, don't tell anybody anything here. I've got this under control. I'm doing what I came to do. Remember, he said, I've got to be in these villages and towns, these cities, so that I can preach my Father's kingdom there. That's his purpose. He's doing it. The man comes, change. He says, don't say anything. Instead, you go to Jerusalem. I've got this under. Go to Jerusalem. Present yourself to the priest. Be the witness of who I am to them. But he doesn't shut up about it. He goes around blabbing it to everyone, to the point at the end of the chapter says Jesus could no longer openly enter a city. Do you realize disobedience is serious? We act as though it only affects us. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We have a corporate responsibility to our family, to our body here at church, to be obedient. I'll put it very plain, Mom and Dad, your disobedience might be the reason why when your child grows up and moves out of the house, doesn't want anything to do with God or the church. Your disobedience might be why that person at work thinks that there's nothing to this Christianity thing. Because after all, pretty much just like everybody else. people wear that badge with pride. No, we are different, folks. In the world, but not of it. He goes and he tells. You know, we often talk about Paul being the first missionary to the Gentiles. That's not true. This guy is. It's powerful because even when there's finally a missionary journey to this region, before anyone else ever came, when they get there, guess what they find? Christians. Are you saying because of this man, Christians were born? Yeah. Because we read that as he goes and he tells, it says, all. Now let me ask you this. How many are all? It's not a trick question. All marvel. It doesn't say all became Christian. They found Christians, some did, but all marvel. And I can't help it. Can you wonder what it must have been like? You're out there doing this spring cleanup in front of your shop or in front of your house, and you watch after this guy. He kind of looks familiar, but can't be the guy I'm thinking about. This guy, I mean, he's got clothes on, and it's familiar, and just kind of walking down the street. And then think about it. If he did have a home, I think that's probably the first place that he went. I mean, if he had a young wife, had some kids, that's probably the first people he wanted to see. So when he gets there, he opens up the door. And the wife, she wasn't expecting any visitors, and she looks, and the kids see as well, and the kids dart behind the door. One runs behind her, and she's preparing herself. This man has been so cruel because of the evil in him, but something's different as he begins to speak. There's a tenderness, there's a love, to the point that in my mind, I can hear her say, "Oh, babies, come on out. Come on out, your daddy's home." I don't know what it was like, but something happened where we see that all marvel. Broken things had been restored. Where man wants to throw away something that's broken, God uses broken things. And you say, "Well, Billy, what's the big deal? Why are we here? We've been talking about the kingdom of peace." Because remember, the reason this matters is Mark presents an aspect of the kingdom. And after he presents the aspect of the kingdom, we see that aspect being played out before our eyes. And what begins in chapter 5 illustrates the entirety of chapter 4. What do you mean? A sower went forth to sow. Jesus and the disciples crossed the sea for the purpose of that one man. Seed fell on hard ground. There's no harder ground than the Decapolis. But it fell there because life was produced within a man that Jesus changed. And when Jesus told him to go and scatter, he went and scattered. And because he scattered, lives were transformed. You can't explain how it happened. It just did it. It's the mystery of the seed. The light was illuminated. Why? The entire area, the entire house got to see the lamp that had come and changed this guy's life, moved him from darkness into the light of the kingdom. Peace overtook. It seemed so insignificant in an insignificant man, but it overtook to the point that all, even those who are on the outside, experienced the peace. Like the fowl nests in the air. They all marveled. There is the entirety of chapter 4. And what's incredible, it keeps happening over and over and over again, all the way through the end of chapter 6. But it's even more incredible because it's happening wherever you are, over and over and over again. See, I don't understand, because we often want to withdraw from the world. But Jesus placed us here for a reason. See, when you withdraw, you tell me that you're only concerned about yourself. Now, I'm not talking about being different. We are different. Aliens and strangers in this land, but we are in this land. And we are here with Christ in us, the hope of glory. So if Christ isn't in you, what hope do you have? And if Christ is in you, you will live your life the way he lived. You'll scatter seed. You'll shine the light. You'll trust the process. You can't rush it. All we have to do is do our part and then believe that what seems insignificant is going to overtake. That's where we fail. We want to be labeled as the insignificant ones, kind of like those people in Nazareth. What? Jesus grew up here, and because of that, nothing could happen in Nazareth. They had such a poor opinion of themselves. Whether you want to admit it or not, your family, your friends, the world is asking the question in many different ways. Who is he? And we are the ones that should say he's Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He's the sower and the seed. He's the seed that produces life when merged with the soil. He's the lamp that comes. He's the mystery revealed. His kingdom will overtake so that others can experience the freedom that comes. But like I said the other day, and I'm not trying to be ugly, but the reality is most of our churches could close up and the community would never know anything had changed. Who is he? It's not a good way to answer a question, but I'm going to. He is. If you haven't listened to anything else, hear this. He is everything you need. We spend our lives looking for so many other things, trying to fill it. He is everything that you need. He's everything that your family needs. He's everything your friends need. The people you don't like, he's everything they need. The little lady that runs you over with her buggy at Walmart, she needs him bad. The question for us is this: will we allow him to be? That allowance calls for surrender. So will we as his people, because remember, we'll know if we've had revival a few weeks, months down the road, to see if the church is awakened to the work of evangelism. Will you surrender all that you are to him, so that he can fill you with all that he is? That's the call to the church. So Jesus, I pray that you'd help us to answer that call. Because there are untouchables all around us. The unloved. The ones that others look down upon. the times that I've made this about me. Forgive us when we got so focused on a mansion on a hilltop that we forgot that there was work that we need to do here. We long for your return. And yet at the same time, there are so many not ready. Family members not ready. People all around us not ready. So help us to take your words seriously in 2 Peter chapter 3. That you're patient, you're long-suffering. Why? Because it's your will that none would perish, but all would come to repentance. So help us to take advantage of the time that we have. Not to treat it like a burden, but take advantage, the opportunity to tell the world who you are.